So, thanks, that was very stimulating. And I should preface this remark by apologizing, because, I mean, it's obvious that this is incredibly difficult work to do, and these animals are very, very difficult to study, and it's easy for us to sit here, nice, dry, stable land with remarkably good weather and critique the project. But you made a couple of interpretations, which I think, at the very least, we should entertain competing hypotheses about.
Good.
Okay.
That's exactly why I'm here.
So the first was the fact that animals strand together suggests that they must have close social bonds. I think that's possible, but there are reasons to think that entirely different explanations could be obtained. So presumably, this is profoundly fitness-reducing behavior.
It's certainly not fitness enhancing.
Yeah, that's quite and it's either presumably due to some kind of pathology, they've got some disease, or there's some evolutionary disequilibrium going on where there's sonar or something that's confusing them, right? The fact that they're acting together doesn't necessarily mean that they have social bonds. So let me give you an analogy. Suppose that you had a subway car, and in a sort of H.G. Wells fashion, somebody hears something on the radio in the subway car and misinterprets it, and the rumor spreads that there's a bomb on the subway car. Okay? And so everyone rushes out of the subway car onto the freeway, and they're all hit by a truck. Okay? Now, what you have there is, maladaptive behavior on the basis of what might normally be adaptive responses to information. It would be a mistake to think that all of the members of the subway car were closely bonded together. They were just all responding to the same information in the same fitness-reducing fashion with the same unfortunate consequence, right? So if all of these animals are diseased, or if they're all responding to, naval sonar or whatever it is that causes the stranding, the fact that they're all doing it at the same time in the same place doesn't necessarily mean that they're tightly connected to each other. Like, oh, well, she went that way, so I gotta go that way too. We could all just be running from the same fire, as it were.
Yeah, the multiple strandings in Tasmania have been very well studied. And what it looks like was probably some oceanographic conditions that brought the prey in much closer to shore. And they probably the thought is, they got disoriented with having a bottom, because it's animals that don't usually deal with bottoms to their environment. Because they were not diseased, they had full bellies, calves lactating. They were healthy animals that stranded, and there were 3 separate strandings. And so what's interesting, I completely agree, and especially things like naval sonar, and there's all sorts of other things that drive animals physically away from something bad happening. What was interesting here was that in some cases it was a calf that stranded first, and the other animal, it was the idea in the case that, unlike what you suggested, is there's not a subway car. They can go the other way, and that's what was interesting. So I should be careful in my use of the word bond, but there was something that those animals, rather than leave a stranded or sick calf by itself, that the whole group, and there were times where there were animals just patrolling the shore back and forth and then came onto the beach. So it seemed like there was a period of time where they could go and do something else. So it's a very unusual behavior, and predicated by a variety of things, from disease to maybe sonar to oceanographic conditions.
I was interested by the case you said where the one group of sperm whales is being circled by a bunch of killer whales, and all of a sudden, from the cavalry comes to the rescue from a distance. What's known about vocalizations? So there's a bunch of questions, I guess. So that kind of helping behavior, where somebody's in need and there's a bunch of potential helpers, that's pretty, the model, theoretical work suggests that's easy to evolve as long as you know when somebody could have helped and didn't. So the question is, were those guys over the horizon? Did the guys that were being attacked, would they have some acoustic way of knowing what they were out there? I mean, do they have this kind of long range?
Yeah, we were saying the male sounds can travel about 20 kilometers. The sounds of females probably 3 to 7, 3 to 10. It depends on oceanographic conditions, and others could probably answer that better. But they could very well be in acoustic contact with each other over those distances. And the aerial behavior also makes a particular acoustic signal on the water. So they were breaching and making a lot of noise. So it
That's the guys that are being attacked. The
Right.
key thing is, what about the guys out there?
Right.
If they wanted to kind of turn their heads
Yeah.
and sail off the other direction, would have the ones,
have they would have
would they known that they've been abandoned?
Well, obviously the 9 here didn't call anybody or no one came. So the first attack, it was
Oh,
in
there
the
was
same
nobody
area,
out
and there was no one came to their rescue, and we didn't, we may have come up on the event, past the window of opportunity to call for aid. But, it brings these questions of what you were asking about, what is a bond versus what is just kind of being in the same area and responding to a cue.
I mean, predator mobbing in other species has a kind of the same flavor, and often the individuals were involved are very closely related. But,
And it's at risk to themselves too, because
yeah, although the risk may be pretty small.
In a group, the bigger
If there's
group.
enough, and there's a frequency dependence, right, so just to watch kites, mob fish eagles, and, once you have 3 or 4 kites, the fish eagles really pretty much can't get any of them, but, it's my understanding that's the standard explanation for predator mobbing, is that, if there's, once you've got enough mobbers, the costs are thought to be low.
And how in that system would the birds ever know that if somebody didn't join?
Well,
Is there a way to
yeah,
get that
I don't
known?
know.
Because it certainly seemed, we were probably looking about at least 5 kilometers. These other whales came in from a distance at which you could say, oh, didn't hear you.
Yeah, right, exactly, exactly.
Yeah, they were not close.
Yeah.
When you talked about the rosette formation and you said sometimes the animals leave to bring an animal that was captured back in, do you know whether whether they were offspring, for example, the animals who left, or is there any reason?
Yeah, unfortunately, we got only one genetic sample from that event, the animal that was killed. The sample is about this big. So it would have been fascinating to know what the genetic relatedness of that group was. The subsequent observation, we got some samples. I think we had 3 or 4 samples from that bigger group 5 days later, and there were multiple haplotypes and no clear relations. But we didn't sample much of the group, so you can't really make a conclusion. So we don't know. It was all adult females. Be fascinating to know.
I was wondering, what to call when the whales gathering together and
That rosette?
rosette. Is that pattern consistent in different locations? Do you observe the same pattern in other populations? And also, is there any other case like hunting together or whatever, breeding seasons that they produce the same pattern?
That's a good question, and we thought when we saw this, and we're on these ships with people that have been at sea observing marine mammals for 30 years, and all over the oceans. And some of these rosettes have been seen before in other places with sperm whales. What was interesting was looking back through the whaling literature and trying to find older examples of this, because when they're being attacked by humans, do they form this behavior? And what was really interesting for us in the second observation, when the animals were lined up and those killer whales went away, we said, great, we can get biopsy samples, and we lower small boats. And we put the small boats in the water and we turn on the outboards, and there were 50 flukes. We knew exactly how to get it. They dove. They got away from us by diving, and they protected themselves from the killer whales by remaining at the surface. We did not have evidence of this from the whaling, which was pretty interesting. But maybe the whalers were busy.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I'm sure you know that this literature on selfish herd behavior, that you don't need any kind of cooperation to get animals to herd together when they're each
In an
trying to
open
minimize,
environment.
right, when they're trying to minimize their chance of being attacked. And it seems like, you know, a possibility to consider is that something like the rosette could be that, you know, when you have motion-sensitive predators, right, that are circling, looking to attack, you know, your best chance may be to not be the one to draw attention, right? And
Trying to hide.
to form basically an equipotential sphere, right, of individuals where nobody is sticking out per se. In that case, you wouldn't want to be the one to attack a killer whale with your flukes, with your tail, right? Because if what causes them to attack an individual is biting a chunk out of them, and they all kind of go nuts, and that individual then becomes the focal individual for predation. It could be that this is kind of a formation that you know, that basically is the best that you can do in a bad situation, to stick all your heads together and not be the one who attracts attention. And then if there's 10 of them, you have 1 in 10 chance of being the one that the killer whale attacks. It seems like that's a possible explanation, and that wouldn't necessarily be a good strategy for human hunting if they're not attacking and using the same kind of strategy.
The whalers used a strategy where they would catch a calf, and then the other females would come in.
Right, which is a totally
Different, yeah.
thing, yeah.
I just was thinking about this observation of the kith and kin, and then what it might say about the role of social bonds in forming and maintaining these groups. And it seems to me that there are a number of examples where you see the same pattern. You see there may be a predominance of kin, but not always, and that there is, when you sort of survey lots of groups, there's a mix of strategies. So if you look at something like male lions, where being in a coalition is really important, close relatives might be preferred partners, but when they're not there, it's better to be, you just can't be alone, right? And it seems like for these guys with predation, well, babysitting's an issue, and predation's an issue. And so, and there might be some size group which is optimal either for coordination or for, that's what's so interesting about these guys is competition usually limits group sizing, something like primates, right? But they don't have that problem because of the nature of their feeding regime.
It does. We were thinking that the optimum unit size, the minimum size, would be that at which you could form a rosette. Versus like, why don't you go down to 3 or 4? Maybe you need, that is the minimum size, and there may be competition and other things that would prefer a smaller group size, but then you're not able to protect yourself.
Or the babysitting units, maybe you need several adult females. And I mean, it's interesting, you might look at the lion literature is kind of interesting because females, they're always related, so but they also have big litters, so that, you know, there are lots of systems, I guess, is what happens. You could. But there are benefits, so the only females who participate in babysitting in the lions are females who have cubs themselves. And yet, at the same time, you're much better off in a bigger crash if there are more babies, more females, you know, involved, invested. And there could be similar kinds of benefits that females benefit from being around other females who might be lactating at the same time and ready to share babysitting or something like that.
And what I was curious that I would hear from some of you is about lactation.
Yeah.
So we have a situation where there was an individual in that one stranding that was fairly old, didn't have young, and is lactating. And I was, you know, it's essentially wet nurses or something. I mean, if that is a group, and, you know, all the caveats. But in sperm whales, there doesn't seem to be a reproductive senescence. They slow down a lot, but, and the interbirth interval gets longer, so maybe in the very later years, they live human lifespans. And so this lactation, the period of lactation can be quite long, and it could be that older females with all the older matriarch knowledge, because think of that habitat, there's how do you know where the squid are, or if it's an El Nino year, you know, or something. How do you know to go here versus here? So having older females that may be lactating and have that, so, you know, ecological knowledge.
You know that paper from elephants about that.
Yeah.
So, do you know how and if males can tell when females are in estrus? So, or when they're lactating, besides them having a cub with them or something like that?
Yeah, I think if you picture, you know, the global oceans and a male looking for a mate, where do you go? How do you, I mean, it's hard. We find these animals on our boats, you know, maybe in a month we'll find 3 or 4 groups. Think if you were a male looking for a mate, you know, how would you know where to go and when to go? And then these interbirth intervals are 4 to 6 years. Your probability, even if you found females, is so low that they would be receptive. It's really interesting how that would happen. So the answer is no, but Hal Whitehead has done some modeling, and he shows that a roaming pattern is the best bet, and that looks like what they do. They may be, male may be in a group from 1 hour to a couple days. But that group I showed from the Galapagos, that male had actually been in with that group and sampled a couple different times. The reason we knew is we thought, wow, you know, here's a group, and the only animals that are related to each other are the males, not the females. And it turned out it was the same male, but he just was there over multiple times, so he seemed to be coming back to the same group. I've been in the Gulf of California when a male showed up in a group of females. It was fascinating. He did those clangs. You could hear him an hour before he ever showed up. And the whole group just got really excited. The females are walking up, and the calves are going up to the male, and they're swimming around him. There was a lot of activity, and this male was so much bigger than these females, and it looks like a completely different species. And he moved around, and then he moved off.
I was wondering if it's known how males acquire rank, because I think you were saying something about them being very sexually dimorphic and, you know, polygyny. So is there any social transmission of rank, or is it just males fighting with other males and physical size determines the outcome, or do you know anything about that, or is it unknown?
Yeah, we don't know very much about that, but the idea is that that's why males go to high latitudes and they just tank up on food. Just get as big as you can, and then they're going to low latitudes, they're swimming thousands of miles looking for females, maybe doing this roaming. How much they eat during that time is not known. There have been fights seen from the air with males coming from kilometers away straight at each other and just ramming their heads together. They have these big straight heads. Football images kind of come to mind. Males spend a lot of time ramming their heads together. But they, that's what I was saying, was this window that we have, that you can stand at the back of a fishing vessel, and you can tell the males apart, because they've got marks and scars and things, so you could identify them and see if there is kind of a dominance hierarchy that goes on there. It wouldn't tell you what happens on the mating grounds, but it would be pretty interesting. And it's the only look we have at anything like that. Wanted to.
Yeah, so do we know what the communicative functions of the codas are? And is there some comparable amount of diversity in the function or the form of the male clangs?
Clangs? Yeah, I don't think it's a good question. I don't think anyone's looked at diversity of male clangs. Kind of clang. But one of the questions I had is whether males are still making codas.
I do.
And we don't see those or hear of those on the foraging grounds very much. It may mean, though, that the recorders and the kind of passive acoustic recorders that are used may not be set to actually get codas, but we think they are. And I actually asked that question of a friend that does acoustic work in Alaska, and he's going to check. It's like, wow, I never really checked. He just was checking for presence and absence of sperm whales, not codas. And in the Mediterranean, it's known that males make codas. But how do males? I mean, did they lose it? Did they just not use it? They only,
but we don't know anything about like, would they change coda if they came in contact with other, okay. And maybe they are using them, I wonder when they're roaming again back towards.
Or if they got in a group of females, yeah. Other than some males in the Mediterranean, I've never heard of adult males making codas, but they obviously came from groups that they were made. And your other question was
do we have any idea of the function?
There's obviously a lot of speculation in how Whitehead has some students looking at that, and the variation among individuals. Is it individual recognition? Is it group recognition? They seem to forage, and they make all the clicks, these simple clicks on the foraging grounds, and they come to the surface when foraging is over, and they socialize, and that's when you hear them. So it does seem to be keeping that group together.
You mentioned that the click duration has something to do with their body size. Can you explain what the mechanism is?
Yeah, so the head is X size, and the sound comes out the back of the head and reverberates through and then is sent out. So there's been ways of modeling that fairly consistently, where you get on the mast of the sailboat, you take a photo, and then you have the length of the animal, and then they can record the clicks. And so there's a pretty good correlation there, just on the physical constraints of the head.
Is there evidence that the whales pay attention to that? So do they do it in any kind of competition?
Or try to make your voice lower.
Still, right.
Yeah, not that I know of, and I don't think that's.
Because if it's reliable index of the body size, that would be a pretty good piece of information for the whales when they're.
Do you play with
Yeah.
experiments with whales?
You certainly could.
I mean, you could play that
Yeah.
a bigger whale, right? You know, you have playing from a bigger guy to this guy, and if there is a sort of dominance, and if they are.
When they're banging their heads together, right? Because you think they may want to avoid banging their heads together if they know.
Yeah.
Females approach or retreat from.
Yeah, it's.
Calls of bigger or smaller males.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest sexually selected organs on the planet, and why you would ram it into another, you would really do that as a last resort.
And there seems to be a lot of differences, right? There's some males are huge, and the other ones.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know of playbacks, but I think in Dominica, where there's this really small area, I think they were going to do some, because it's hard to get reliable sperm whales. So you need, there's only a few places that you can go where you could actually not spend your whole grad career waiting to do the playback. And I seem to remember that Shane Jarrell was going to do something, or was thinking of that, but I don't know of any.
Was the range of sounds you gave us for the whales pretty much the range of sounds that they make, or is that just a portion of a much larger repertoire?
No, that's pretty much it for these guys. So they're very different from the baleen whales that males sing and things like that. And I've done work, we've published a few papers on global blue whale song, and there it's different, where the song is geographically associated. So whales in different areas sing different songs. And that's different than this. This is interesting because it's this nomadic pattern where whales in one area could sing or could use different coda types. I think I've got, let me just look through this really quickly. I think I have, this is blue whale songs. So there's 9, and now we have 10 types globally. So, and they're stable over time in an area 30 to 40 years at least. So if you give one of my co-authors a whale song, and they can do the fancy work they need to do to it to get it to be quantified, they can tell you, where it comes from. And there's three interesting things about this. One is that it's geographically set. It's temporally constant. But also, the next thing that we were going to look at is in some areas it's more complex than others. So in the Indian Ocean, these populations have very complex calls. In the Southern Ocean, really simple. It's just like a flat line. It's like, here I am. You know, whaling did away with 99% of these whales, so just singing, and it's all males, that a female can hear you is a good thing. So a really simple call that goes a long distance. But here the calls are much more complex. And it looks like these are resident populations, so I wonder if it's kind of the evolution of like song complexity that you see with more selection going on. So this is a very different situation than just males sing. And let me see the next slide here. Yeah, let me play you, these are minke whale calls. I'll just play you these because they're really amazing. So minke whales are the smallest of the baleen whales. And here's what these sound like. Really wild. Totally different. What we were using these for in this particular type of work is looking at population identity and using acoustics to identify populations. And the point here is that we will almost never get genetic samples or morphology. And it looks like we may have multiple species, subspecies, cryptic species. Acoustics is a really strong tool, and trying to get marine mammal taxonomists to use acoustics is quite difficult. And in management, it's really important because we have tens of thousands of calls and 100 genetic samples. To be able to look at structure and manage populations, acoustics is a really good tool. It's very hard to convince people that it's a behavioral trait that can be used, perhaps, but what we do have is these long-term records because of the Navy, that they're making the same sounds, and the sounds are not changing in these areas, so it at least should be in the conversation for being useful that way. But there's a lot of exceptions. You get a humpback whale changing its call, and then all the acoustics gets thrown out. So we're really working hard to get behavioral traits included in population identity.
I have a two-part question. First is how feasible is something like paternity testing to test ideas about what kinds of traits like males have that could be being currently sexually selected or something like this, right? In the absence of that kind of feasibility, you can imagine that you might be able to have some kind of psychological study that you kind of almost started describing with this male coming in and the female's getting excited. You can imagine that those kinds of things could potentially be, those kind of interactions could potentially be coded for certain kinds of characteristics that presumably you're recording this, like the sounds actually come from the male, and to what extent does that correlate with, you know, some kind of, you know, measure of excitement or some sort of, you know, how many individuals swim up to him when he's, right, those kinds of things.
That would be a dream, and I would say probably just about impossible in sperm whales. That's why I did my dissertation on blennies, which are these little fish, so you could ask those questions. These animals, it would be really hard to do the paternity because you don't need to sample all the males, but the more males you have, potential fathers, the stronger your paternity exclusions at least. And that would be difficult to do, but we're collecting samples of males all over, and we can certainly try to look within groups of what's the probability that how many fathers are the young in a group would have. But we're also, depending on where you are and the legality, we can't even collect samples from calves. So it's really tricky. It's probably just not the species you work on for that.
What about the possibility, I mean, how often do those kinds of interactions that you describe occur?
Pretty rare. You feel like you've made your whole year if you see males showing up with females. There's been studies where they've never seen a male, like the one in Dominica in the Caribbean. They hadn't seen males at all. which is kind of interesting, because there's a lot of calves, so. But only there at some times, so.
Or at some surfaces.
The Gulf of California is very unusual for having a lot of adult males come through, so it would be a good place to do that. And I do have a student who did that work on the Alaska males. Her PhD will be looking at males globally, and so it's a slow accumulation, but I think she'll have some other chapters too.
Can you put transponders on these guys to track them?
Yes, and there's been some of the most fascinating work recently has been done. They've tagged males that are foraging off those boats up in Alaska. And every year, in the last couple of years, they've tagged a couple. This is Cascadia Research has done this, and a couple other people, I'm forgetting their names right now, but I'll remember them soon. But they've tagged males, they forage along the back of the boats up in southeast Alaska, and then they head straight south. They do not deviate, they do not forward. You can't see tracks going like this. There's straight line tracks at maximum swim speeds into the Gulf of California. One went to the border of Guatemala, and the transmitter expired. Another male was tagged in the Channel Islands. He's been seen out there quite a bit, and he took off after meandering around for quite a while. He took off, and same thing, just straight line down into south in Mexico. So very interesting, and very different behaviors. I mean, it's straight line swimming.
Spring break.
Yeah.
Control with the law.
And what's wrong with those California girls anyway?
Okay, I think we'll leave it there.